Warning, this video contains spoilers for 20th Century Boys and 21st Century Boys. Friend from Naoki Urasawa's 20th Century Boys is often hailed as one of the greatest antagonists in manga history, but to this day, a shocking number of people don't actually understand Friend's true identity, even after the official English release of the perfect edition of the manga, and I wanted to talk about that. To give some brief context as to what the perfect edition is, it is a slightly expanded and occasionally redrawn re-release of the manga that came around a decade after its original serialization. 20th Century Boys and 21st Century Boys combined originally serialized from 1999 to 2007, with the Kanzenban or Perfect Edition releasing in 2016. For the most part, in comparison to the original manga, the Perfect Edition only features a few redraws and a couple of additional pages of content every now and then. But the final chapter of the Perfect Edition of 21st Century Boys would come to reveal something critical about Friend's true identity, with a twist nearly identical to one that was originally seen in the third live-action movie for 20th Century Boys released back in 2009. For years, because the live-action adaptation made so many changes to the manga story anyways, most didn't really pay it any heed. Most people, admittedly including myself not too long ago, were under the impression that in the original manga, two different people took on the role of Friend, the first being Fukubei and the second being Katsumata. But this is not the case, neither in the original version of the manga, nor in the Perfect Edition, of course. Those of you who have read the Perfect Edition of the manga would know that the final chapter of 21st Century Boys is considerably extended, with Kenji confirming that Fukubei had died as a child and that this whole time, Friend was just Katsumata. However, even after this, a number of people have looked at this reveal as a retcon to match the live-action adaptation, or as the Perfect Edition being in a completely separate continuity due to having trouble reconciling this reveal with what they had perceived of the prior story. Even when I first learned about this reveal, I thought that it just didn't make all that much sense. But in 2018, Urasawa had an interview in episode 51 of Fuji TV's Mando Kobayashi program, in which he explicitly confirmed that even in the original version of 20th Century Boys, Katsumata was always the sole friend from start to finish, with all others being misleading. He further went on to say that 20th Century Boys was the story of Katsumata's admiration for Fukubei. Urasawa's comments in said interview would serve to definitively confirm that there being only one friend was what he had always intended at every step of the way. So Katsumata being the sole friend was unambiguously always Urasawa's intention in every version of the story. With this understanding, I increasingly look at the Perfect Edition as indeed being the definitive version of 20th Century Boys, since figuring out this aspect of Friend's true identity is almost impossible without those extra pages in 21st Century Boys' final chapter. And the Perfect Edition also ends off on a much more climactic note than just God talking about his anticipation for the bowling boom. But in any case, Urasawa sure fooled a lot of us who went through the original version of the story, the same way that Katsumata managed to fool most of the cast. After all, the series does have a crazy number of red herrings earlier on in the story. So I wanted to go over a couple of points that some might regard as potential discrepancies. The first and biggest of these is Friend's death at Yamane's hands back in the science room. Ocho and everyone there had confirmed that the person behind the mask had indeed died and that he had Fukubei's face at the very least. With Friend seemingly having been revived, and with most of the central cast members mistaking the post-resurrection Friend to be a completely different person, most were under the impression that Fukubei died there in the science room while somebody else took over Friend's role at the attempted assassination of the Pope. As per Urasawa's comments in said interview, someone indeed died at Yamane's hands, but it was just a body double, not Fukubei. Such would be reminiscent of what we saw at the Bloody New Year's Eve. The whole idea of Katsumata faking his own death in the science room and then reviving himself is that he did what Fukubei failed to do. Fukubei's miracle was a lie. That was the lie of 1971. He didn't physically die and come back to life. Donkey called him out on it, and Fukubei's friends saw his fraudulence for themselves when he slipped up and started hanging for real. But Katsumata had performed what others perceived as a true miracle, and on the world stage. Speaking of which, some of you might be wondering, when did Fukubei actually die? Was it when he hung himself in the science room in 1971? And the answer to that is no, because we see Fukubei, or at the very least, a kid identical to Fukubei, in a flashback taking place in 1972, and funnily enough, he's wearing a turtleneck in that scene, possibly to cover up scars from the slip-up with hanging himself. And besides, would Katsumata have really been able to take over his appearance and role all the way back then? Probably not. I doubt a kid could just get plastic surgery just like that. Yamane following Friend for so long also would not have made sense if he knew that Fukubei died and that Katsumata was Friend. And in the first place, in the perfect edition of 21st Century Boys, Kenji states that Fukubei died during spring break after elementary school, meaning between 6th and 7th grade, and thus between March and April of 1972. Fukubei is even seen in the class's elementary school graduation photo, serving as further confirmation of the timing of his demise. I think it's very fitting that Fukubei physically died as pitifully and unnoticed as he lived. To the bitter end, Fukubei was completely forgotten, just like Katsumata. Moreover, I think the way that Chapter 176 ends off the simulation flashback, not explicitly showing what happened after the nooses safety knot was undone, is fitting in that it's a representation of a metaphorical death for Fukubei. As Yamane put it in Chapter 128, the lie of 1971 is both where Friend was born, as well as where Friend died. And since we know Fukubei didn't physically die in 1971, this would indeed be entirely metaphorical. This contrast between someone physically dying and metaphorically dying is one that 20th Century Boys explores throughout its entire story. We see this with Kenji, Ocho, Sadakio, Fukubei, Katsumata, and even Donkey. This contrast is perhaps most evident in Chapter 157, wherein Kana talks to the simulated Donkey of 1971 in the context of discussing the ghost of the science room. As Kana exits the simulation, they have one final exchange, with Kana arguing that when people die, it's not that they get reduced to nothingness, but that they continue to exist in people's memories. It's only when people are truly forgotten by everybody that they die. This is more or less the fundamental thesis of 20th Century Boys, that true death is being forgotten. And Katsumata, to the very end, was faceless and forgotten by the whole world, with us never, ever seeing his true face, as if he were just a teru bozu. The day he was framed for stealing was when Fukubei had told him outright, "Today you died." And thus from that point onwards, everybody believed Katsumata to be dead, with his ghost haunting the science room forever, which is why everybody but Donkey was afraid of entering the science room on the night of August 31st, 1971. Conversely, even when the whole world believed Kenji to have died, his presence was always felt all throughout the story. He's not physically around for over half the manga, but he never feels like he's truly gone. And in that sense, he wasn't dead, even if he were to have actually been physically deceased. So these notions of metaphorical versus physical life and death are fairly evident in multiple case studies throughout the story. Now, another confusing point for a lot of people is with regards to how nearly everyone believed Friend to be a different person after the Pope's assassination. Moreover, he'd also worn different masks before and after the Pope's assassination, with the first of these being that of Ninja Hattori-kun, seemingly representing Fukubei. Ultimately, as was confirmed by Urasawa himself, these were just a sequence of red herrings. We even see the person that Kiriko knew to have been Fukubei to be wearing the second of Friend's masks right after Kanna's birth, more or less confirming that the masks don't truly represent two different people. But nobody believing post-rebirth Friend to be the same person as before is also pretty much the whole point. Friend's whole existence is so steeped in lies that any semblance of truth becomes impossible to see. Even Kanna, who herself had special powers, was deceived by Friend. The understanding that Friend was just Katsumata all along does also considerably recontextualize his conversation with Kanna in the later stages of the story, where Katsumata talks about the time he picked her up from the stroller as a child. He's telling the truth throughout it all. With Katsumata, a true psychic, being Kanna's true father, the origin of her special abilities also makes much more sense, and if Katsumata wasn't the same person as who everyone believed to be Fukubei, there would have been no way that he could have experimented on Kiriko. It's also quite fitting that in this exact conversation, the two of them have a bit of an exchange over the meaning of real and fake, truth and lie, a contrast Urasawa has repeatedly explored in a number of his stories. Fukubei's metaphorical death, having been with the lie of 1971, is very fitting in that it's where his friends realized that him being this superhuman known as Friend was a complete and utter lie. If there is one line from the manga that I would use to sum up Friend's character, it's this: the copy of the copy is the one who takes the world by storm, and Katsumata is exactly that. A copy of a copy, or otherwise, an imitation of an imitation. When you go back and reread 20th Century Boys with the hindsight and understanding that Katsumata was always the sole friend, there's a number of other hints that make it increasingly evident. For instance, one of Friend's first appearances is at a rock concert, and Fukubei himself has the CD for T-Rex's 20th Century Boy in his fake home with the three little kids that Kenji cooks for. In none of the Kid Fukubei flashbacks do we see any inkling of him being remotely interested in rock music. This goes in direct contrast to Katsumata, who is shown to be very invested in rock music, and especially 20th Century Boy, with it being a song that quite literally saved his life. In addition to that, there's a few times throughout the story where people do question whether Friend is truly two different people, as some suspect, making it evident that this theory might not actually be true. In Kenji's final confrontation with Friend, Katsumata also states that Fukubei had been with him for a long time, as if he were a part of him. Another strong hint to Katsumata having been the sole friend all along. If you read the scanlations for the manga instead of the official translation via the Perfect Edition, then you do also have the unfortunate drawback of some translation errors in the last third of the manga, which gut out some of the foreshadowing. In general, the scanlations take a huge nosedive in quality in the last third of the manga anyhow, so if you can afford it, I would definitely recommend reading the entirety of the story via the Perfect Edition, at the very least for the last couple of volumes. With that in mind, I hope you found this video useful in better understanding Friend's true identity. When I'd first gone through the Perfect Edition's ending of 21st Century Boys, I was shocked. I'd already gone through the entirety of the manga from start to finish thrice beforehand, and I did not reach such a conclusion. Yet once I understood the Perfect Edition's ending, as I went further back through the manga again, I found a number of hints and realized it was entirely possible that Katsumata being the sole friend was indeed always Urasawa's intention. And when I found out about the interview wherein Urasawa explicitly confirmed that this was the case, that was both unsurprising and yet a little saddening for myself personally, since I spent so many months working on my first ever video for the channel, only for the very basis of my analysis to fundamentally be completely wrong, since Fukubei was never actually Friend. And to be fair, the vast majority of friend-related videos on YouTube are wrong in general, since Friend's true identity just wasn't common knowledge until very, very recently. I still feel as though a pretty substantial chunk of my original analysis on chapters 171 to 176 is still valid, even with Katsumata having been the sole friend all along. But let me know if you'd ever like to see me remake my first video ever. As flawed as that video may be, if I never made it, I would never have become a YouTuber. And it also remains as evidence of a time where the overwhelming majority of people had a fundamentally wrong understanding of the story of 20th Century Boys. Special thanks to Maxi, Fuser, Kami, and Moose for their help in the making of this video. And I'll see the rest of you around. Let me know if there's another topic you'd like to see me cover.